Hello, and welcome back to another update where we cover the latest developments throughout the front line. Starting out in the southern front, we see that the Russian forces have taken the initiative around Verbovo Novorossiysk, where they managed to counterattack and regain some positions at the outskirts of these areas, after which the Ukrainian forces have tried to counterattack and regain some of the positions they recently lost, but none of them have been successful, leading to no territorial gains since a couple of weeks ago in these directions. As for the northwest of Robotyne, the Ukrainians decided to attack in the direction of Nestyryanka and Kopani. It seems that their objective here is to expand their current foothold here in the southeastern parts of Novodanilivka to avoid a closure of the salient and to improve their positions in preparation for a long and drawn out offensive. So rather than having a shallow salient here in the southern front, they'll have a much wider one, doubling the size of it by capturing the villages of Kopani, Rivne, and Syrianka. With the capture and control over Robotyne, they're now able to go around most of these fortifications and also pressure Kopani from the southern, eastern, and northwestern directions by spreading out their forces and launching attacks in these directions altogether. So the latest developments here in a nutshell is that the Ukrainian forces continue to try and improve their current situation by expanding their holdings here to the north of the main defensive line, while the Russian forces are trying to push the Ukrainian forces beyond the first main defensive line and out of Novorokopivka to avoid any breakthrough in this direction. We then move on to the Removsky Lech area, where the Russian forces continue to pressure the Ukrainian forces in the direction of Urushaina and Seromayovsk. According to the latest information, the Russian forces here attacking are just small in scale and mainly focused around artillery. But the situation has changed in the sense that the Ukrainians have been unable to advance in this direction for a month now. So with this, we see that the Ukrainian forces are unable to advance in the Vermovsky Lech area, signing the end of the Ukrainian offensive in the south, as they have not been able to advance in anywhere across this southern front for a couple of weeks now. So with this, there's no continuous offensive. It has ended, and now we see a territorial positional battle taking place in the southern front for the Ukrainians to try to hold on to their gains and the Russians to try to negate the Ukrainian gains. We then move on to the Donetsk area, where there's been reports of Russian forces attacking in three directions, both in the northern direction of Marinka, south of Avdiivka, and north of Avdiivka. In the Marinka area, we've seen that they've managed to advance slightly here in the northern parts. However, there's also been reports of further advancements, but there's been no territorial changes according to Syriac maps as of yet. So until such an update comes, the fighting continues here in the Marinka area. As for the northern parts by Avdiivka, both to the south and to the north, it's just positional battles. There's no offensive or anything like that. The Russian forces are trying to negate the recent Ukrainian gains by Opitne to expand the buffer zone between the village and the Ukrainian positions. And in the northern directions, there were some positional battles over the railways here to the north of Avdiivka. However, there's been no territorial changes here either. We then move on to the Bakhmut direction, where the Ukrainian forces continue their attempts at crossing the railway lines, which the Russian forces are using as their defensive line right now. The Ukrainian forces have been unable to pass through. The last advancement was on the 1st of October here to the north of Klishivka, and since then there's been no advancements in this direction, as the Russian forces are holding on to their positions. So the Ukrainian forces have not had a single advancement for the past week on the whole front line. As for to the north of Bakhmut, in the direction of Siversk, we see that the Russian forces started attacking in three directions, both in the direction of Vesele, as well as to the north of Berestov in the direction of Vyemka, and in the direction of Spirne. So the Russian forces are here launching small-scale attacks, trying to improve their position and threaten the Ukrainian forces, splitting up their forces to prevent them from concentrating them, and generally putting pressure on the Ukrainian forces. Moving further north in the direction of the Luhansk and Kharkiv borders, we see that the Russian forces managed to advance in the direction of Makiivka, just ever so slightly, trying to go further down the Serebets river line and advancing in the direction of Makiivka, where fighting has reached. We also see some fighting in the direction of Novojaworivka to the north of the direction, fighting over the hills and high grounds in the area. As for the northern parts by the Kupiansk area, we've heard of reports of fighting by Kislivka and Sinkivka, as well as in the direction of Petropavlivka, and the forest areas to the direction of Liman Pershi. So according to the latest reports, the Ukrainian forces have managed to push the Russian forces slightly back, but the Russian forces are now negating that claim, saying that they have managed to recapture it after leaving those positions. But until Syriac Maps updates, this will be under Ukrainian control. Fighting continues in the direction of Sinkivka and Petropavlivka, where the Russian forces are fighting the supply road between the two villages to prevent further supply and connection between the two villages and weaken the Ukrainian positions by Sinkivka. As for the direction of Kislivka, the Russian forces are fighting here to the north of the village in between it and Ivanivka, trying to put some pressure on the Ukrainian forces, again splitting them up from focusing their forces here in the northern parts to prevent a Russian advance, and then having to split it up between the northern and eastern parts. Now, with the recent developments all throughout the front line, we also have to look at the lifeline of the Ukrainian forces, which is the Western support of weaponry that is being sent to them year-round. So in relation to that, we have to look at the general level of support by Western countries towards sending weapons to Ukraine. And in that relation, there's been many speed bumps along the way. But most recently, we have seen that the election in Slovakia ended with the former prime minister winning the election. We're now forming a government, and the interim government has already said they will stop sending weapons to Ukraine. And the former prime minister said he wanted to stop the support for Ukraine. So that is one of the border countries and one of the biggest supporters for Ukraine stopping its aid. Slovakia has sent both tanks as well as former Soviet aircraft to Ukraine. So this is a major source of support for Ukraine that has now stopped. At the same time, we also hear reports that Poland will continue sending what they've already promised, but once that is over, they will stop sending further equipment and ammunition and weaponry to Ukraine, as they have essentially sent all they have wanted to send. Meanwhile, we see that in the United States, there's been the cut off of the budget because the fiscal year has ended, and therefore they had to create a new budget. So far, they have extended the current budget by 45 days, and with that, it is very difficult for the US government to send further aid to Ukraine within these 45 days, and whether or not there will be a new budget with a large aid to Ukraine in the next budget, that is up for question, because it seems that the Republicans don't want to send a lot more to Ukraine. They want to limit it a lot more because there's been a lot of spending in the United States and a lot of debts being picked up by the government. So there's multiple things among the governments that is already showing cracks within the support for Ukraine. And meantime, we see articles like this one. Juncker, which is a former European Commission chief, says Ukraine is totally corrupt and the EU candidacy for Ukraine is unreasonable. We also see the old article by the New York Times where they analyze the missile strike on the marketplace, where they essentially say, based on the evidence, it is likely that it was a Ukrainian missile and not a Russian missile that actually hit the Ukrainian marketplace in Konstantinivka. We also see articles by Danish media outlets. For example, the recent missile strike that happened in a village in Kharkiv. The Danish media outlet said, and I quote, the Russians could have had an objective with this, whether it be a politicians or a military officer or someone else who was present at the time, according to the information. Basically, although they are doing so many articles talking about how terrible it is, how many people died and all of these things, they still write this one article that says there could have been a purpose, and there's no confirmation that they did this without a purpose. There's no information that they are doing this systematically, and therefore they are spewing doubt that the Russians are doing these things that the Ukrainians are constantly accusing them of. So with this, we are seeing that there are some cracks in the support for Ukraine, and these are developing as time goes by. with the corruption scandals that has hit Ukraine time after time, even among the Ukrainian soldiers fighting by the front line, they worry more about the corruption scandals within Ukraine than what is actually happening by the front line due to the severity of the issues with essentially the whole defense ministry being fired at one point and so on. So there's so many issues within the corruption part of Ukraine, and with the Western support cracking, they are worried that they lose the war not because they stop fighting, but because the Western aid stops. And according to the latest information, Ukrainian officials said that if the United States stops supporting Ukraine, they'll run out of ammunition in a month and a half. So there's hardly much to fight for if the United States stop the support. And without the new budget, without the new agreements, there will be no support.